I don't come to DC very often, but when I heard about this panel, I thought I would weather the cold and come over and witness this group of luminaries that we have with us. And tomorrow, inshallah, God willing, we will start our fast, the month of Ramadan. So what a great Ramadan blessing to have this panel. And in Ramadan, there's a saying that when you go there as Muslims are ready to break the fast, when you look at a Muslim before he breaks his fast and after he breaks his fast, you believe in life after death. So we will exercise that for 30 days, God willing. The issue of religious coexistence is a very interesting topic. Redwan picked it, and I think it's a very important one. I have to say that we need to practice religious coexistence here in America before we start preaching it anywhere else. And when people travel the world, especially in the region, they notice that there is religious coexistence among the people. As you go higher up in politics and status and class and so on and so forth, that's where you see the friction. My father is from Iraq, and when he grew up in the 30s, he said, honestly, you couldn't tell who was the Iraqi Christian, or the Iraqi Jew, or the Iraqi Muslim. We were all one people. And that was his upbringing, and that really is our principle as well, that we belong to one root, even with different branches. And that's the foundation of religious coexistence. The Quran says in Surah Al-Baqarah, the second chapter of the Quran, we believe in God and in that which has been bestowed from on high upon us, and that which has been bestowed upon Abraham and Ishmael and Isaac and Jacob and their descendants, and that which has been vouchsafed to Moses and Jesus, and that which has been vouchsafed to all the prophets by their sustainer. We make no distinction among them, and it is unto him that we surrender ourselves. So the idea that religion has been a part of world history to different people at different times, yet we all belong to the same God and worshiping the same God, is the foundation, I believe, of the three major Abrahamic faiths. So this panel, I have to say, whether it's Peter Beinart or Mustafa Eichel or Mother Agapia, has restored our faith in humanity. When we listen to what they say, they are bearing witness to the truth. And as the Quran says, stand up for justice, bear witness to the truth to God, even if you have to testify against yourself or your parents or your own community. That is the parameter and barometer of bearing witness to the truth. And all three have done that in their work. So we not only restore our faith in humanity, but they help us restore our faith in our own faiths. And with that, I welcome Redwan Masmoudi in leading us in moderating this very, very important discussion. Thank you very much. Assalamu alaikum.
Thank you very much, Salam, and it's really good to see you, come from all the way from Los Angeles to join us at this event. Really? But cold there is when it's 60 degrees, right? Good afternoon. Welcome. My name is Radwan Masmoudi. I'm the founder and president of the Center for the Study of Islam and Democracy. I'm also a senior advisor here at MPAC, and it's a pleasure to welcome you to our third World Policy Forum here at MPAC, where we try to bring excellent speakers and scholars to really talk about, difficult issues and difficult problems. Of course, there is no other problem, I think, in the world today that is bigger and more difficult and more challenging than the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which has been ongoing now for almost 80 years. In fact, next year it will be 80 years, 8 decades. And it seems like there is no end in sight. It seems like people are becoming hopeless, and there is no hope for how we can solve this conflict in a fair and just way. People on both sides have been suffering, of course, more so on the Palestinian side. but we see extremism on both sides. We see violence on both sides, and we see, unfortunately, a government in Israel that has basically given up on the idea of a two-state solution or recognizing a Palestinian state or Palestinian people. And like Netanyahu for 20 years has been prime minister, and he thinks that he can get rid of the Palestinian people by any means necessary. And of course, it's not possible because there is 6, 7 million Palestinians still living there, whether in Gaza or the West Bank. And I think, it's impossible to, get rid or displace 6 or 7 million people. It's also impossible to expect them not to react when their rights are taken away. They're going to react, and people are not going to just be quiet and, and forget that they have rights. So this problem is there is immense suffering on both sides, and it seems to be intractable. It seems like we don't have any ideas for how we solve this problem. So we thought that we will turn to a religion. What does religion teach about coexistence with other faiths, especially the three Abrahamic religions, Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, and also to history, how have they been living in the Middle East and in the Holy Land, these three major Abrahamic religions. Is peace possible? Is it possible? Can we hope that peace will come to the Holy Land and to the Middle East, and that this conflict will end soon? So today we have three really amazing speakers. We are very happy and glad that they were able to join us. Finally, we've been working on it for months. We have, of course, Peter Beinart, who is a journalist and a political thinker. He's the editor at large of Jewish Currents. He has his own newsletter. Please subscribe to his newsletter. There is a link in the back, or a flyer in the back, that you can take with you to subscribe. He writes constantly on Israel and Palestine and the conflict in the Middle East, on democracy, on equality, on moral responsibility. He's been a very, very active voice and vocal voice for peace and justice for many years. So we are very happy to have him with us today. Mother Agapia Stephanopoulos also is an amazing lady. I'm sure you all know her and have seen her in the different interviews and podcasts. She's an Orthodox Christian nun and scholar focused on theology and ethics and interfaith dialogue and understanding. And finally, we have Mustafa Akyol, who is a senior fellow at the Cato Institute, and he writes mostly on religious freedom, on Islam and tolerance, and what does Islam teach about, pluralism and modernity. And so we have three excellent speakers, one from each faith. I hope that the debate will be really illuminating on these questions about what does each religion teach about interfaith dialogue and coexistence. What does history teach about living together, and is there hope? Is peace possible in the Middle East? Whether it's the two-state solution or one-state solution, how are we going to find a solution to this enduring problem? So who wants to go first? I did not ask you this question, but anybody who wants to volunteer and go first?
Most ancient faith should go first.
Okay. So, Peter, you can speak from there or here, whichever makes you.
I'll sit here.
Okay, very good.
Well, I'm very, very honored to be here. And I should say I do not consider myself a scholar of Judaism. Much in Judaism baffles me. But I do my best to make sense of a tradition that I love and I find challenging, but also sustaining. And I think it's a mistake, it seems to me, in conversations like this for me to try to suggest that there is something inherent in Judaism that leads one to kind of progressive political principles. Judaism is an ancient religion like Islam and Christianity, which is an ocean and is interpreted in vastly different ways in different times and different places. And for every verse in Torah or in Talmud that I could cite that affirms the equality and dignity of all human beings. Bezalel Smotrich would quote me another one that is not only tribal but even genocidal. Those are there as well. It's all in the commentary. It's all in how you interpret it. One of the things I love most about Judaism is the tradition of radical commentary, the radical rethinking of it, and not always just looking at the plain text. It seems to me one has to look at these texts with some foundational principles. What is your basic prism through which you view these texts? And for me, I would just state two and then say something about how I think they connect to Israel and Palestine. The first is the basic truth that I don't know any debate about this in Judaism, that the first human beings that we encounter in Torah are not Jews. They're not Israelites. They're not even proto-Jews or Israelites, right? This is before Abraham, right? Adam, Eve, the generation of Noah, Cain, Abel, the people of the Tower of Babel. These are just universal human beings. They're universal human beings, right? And I think this affirms the basic idea that irrespective of one. Oh, sorry. Okay. My apologies. Well, yes. The no Jewish commentary that I know would reject the idea that the first human beings you encounter in Torah are not Jews or Israelites or even proto-Jews or Israelites. They are before Abraham. They are universal human beings, Adam and Eve and the generations that follow until Abraham. And I think that to me, that the foundational message there is that all human beings are created in the image of God and have inherent, inalienable worth. Rabbi Abraham Joshua Heschel said, the human being is the only thing created in the image of God. Every human being created equal in the image of God. And it seems to me that is a foundational lens through which to see everything in Jewish tradition, because this is the beginning of Torah. And I think it has very dramatic implications for how we think about the relationship between individuals and states. We were just talking about the Israeli Orthodox social critic Yeshayahu Leibovich, who I write in my book. And Leibovich was asked this question: do you believe that Israel has a right to exist as a Jewish state? You may be familiar with this question because this is essentially the question that people have to answer yes to in order to be considered legitimate participants in this conversation, right? And Leibovich, who was an Orthodox Jew, answered, no state has a right to exist. He went back, he said, human beings have a right to exist because human beings are created in the image of God. States have only conditional value, not unconditional value. They're instruments. They may be necessary, they can protect human life and create conditions for human flourishing, and they can destroy human life. And they can only be, they must always be judged against in terms of how they impact the human being, because it is the human being that's created in the image of God. And if you elevate the state over the human being, when it is the human being created in the image of God, not the state, actually then you move towards idolatry, which was his great fear. And in Jewish tradition, idolatry is very, very deeply connected to barbarism. The figure that in Jewish tradition, the way you think of the figure of Pharaoh is that Pharaoh's tyranny is intimately linked to the fact that Pharaoh considered himself a god, to Pharaoh's idolatry. And it seems to me that when I look at at many Jewish communities in the United States and certainly in Israel, and I say this, it's very painful for me to say this because these are communities that are immensely important to me. I see very frequently the idolatry of the state, in which the test of whether you are a Jew in good standing is not whether you observe Jewish law and not whether you respect the inherent God-given dignity of the individual, but whether you support this state, without reference to the question of what the state is doing to all the people under its control, right? And it seems to me, if a state has killed 100,000 people in Gaza and created more child amputees per capita than any other place on earth and destroyed 80% of the homes and 70% of the farmland, and we believe that those people are created in the image of God, then something is fundamentally wrong with the state, and we are required to try to reimagine the state so it can better respect the lives and the dignity of all the people under its control. The second principle that it seems to me very important when I think about Judaism is the centrality of the story of bondage in Egypt and the Exodus. This is referred to again and again and again throughout Torah as a kind of guiding principle. And you may know Jews read through the Torah, the first 5 books of the Hebrew Bible, one portion a week. And this last Saturday's portion is Parsha Mishpatim, which follows the giving of the 10 Commandments and is a whole series of laws, right? And again in Parsha Mishpatim, and then subsequently in Torah, you see this refrain: you must not oppress the stranger because you know the heart of the stranger, because you were strangers in the land of Egypt. It recurs again and again and again. And on this line, the Spanish Jewish commentator Nachmanides, Moses ben Nachman, has this lovely interpretation. He says, "Why do you need to be told to not oppress the stranger?" And he said it's because when people see the stranger, when they see the person who is the outsider, the person who doesn't have status, doesn't even have potentially protection of law, they think, I can do whatever I want to that person because they have no one to protect them, right? Because they have no power, because they have no status and rights, right? It's so resonant of the situation we see here. And Nachmanides says the point of this verse in Mishpatim is to remember that that is not the case. Right? Because even if there is no human power that recognizes the rights and dignity and pressure of the stranger, God does. That is the lesson of the story of the bondage and the exodus from Egypt. And so, to me, that also leads to the principle that, which again you see clearly in Mishpatim, other places in Torah, that there should be one law for people. We are all strangers to one another in some sense, right? So there should be one law for the person that you consider the stranger, and that should be the same law as yourself. That people should live under the same law. And whether Israel-Palestine is going to be partitioned into 2 states, or whether there's 1 state, or how many states, to me actually is less important than the principle that governs these states. And the principle, it seems to me, should be the principle that Jews and Palestinians, wherever they live, because no matter how you partition the land, Jews and Palestinians are going to be living alongside one another, right? 20% of Israel's citizens are Palestinian, right? Even if there were a Palestinian state in the West Bank, it seems to me, and there would probably be Jews living in a Palestinian state in the West Bank if there were created one. So it seems to me the principle should be that wherever Jews and Palestinians live together, they live under the same law. This is the same principle that we're fighting for with a lot of difficulty here in the United States. It's the principle that people are fighting about in India, in Hungary, in France, across the world, a global struggle about whether states are the property of one tribe and everybody who's not of the dominant tribe is a guest at best, or whether all human beings who live in a state are equal irrespective of their race, religion, and ethnicity. And I'll end here. To me, the tragedy of the organized American Jewish communities in this moment in the United States is that a community that, to a large extent, in the 1950s and 60s, during the Civil Rights Movement, when American democracy faced a moment of crucible, was on the right side, because American Jews, through an act of enlightened self-interest, saw that if Black Americans achieved first-class citizenship, then the remaining barriers to Jewish first-class citizenship would also be washed away. That the legacy of the move towards focusing on Israel as the centerpiece of organized American Jewish life, which really happened starting in the 1970s, has meant that the most powerful American Jewish organizations like AIPAC or the Anti-Defamation League, when they look at politicians, the fundamental question they ask is, does this politician support unconditional support for Israel? And when they look at other communities, the question they ask is, does this other community unstintingly support Israel no matter what? And that criteria then becomes an excuse to be agnostic on the question, at best agnostic, on the question of whether a politician or another community supports equality under the law and the survival of liberal democracy in the United States. And so a community that, my community, which is unusually politically articulate and could be a powerful force in fighting fascism and fighting for liberal democracy, actually is its most powerful institutions are more comfortable with an authoritarian, fascist United States government that unconditionally supports Israel than they would be with a democratic United States moving in the direction of equality under the law, which also applied that same principle of equality under the law to Israel and Palestine.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Peter. This was really excellent, short and sweet. Should we go to the next religion, Christianity? Yes. Whatever. Yes, please.
I apologize. I'm not quite the experienced, is this on?
Yes. Should be.
Speaker. I'm grateful to MPAC and SSID for providing this opportunity to talk about the three Abrahamic faiths and how all of us can contribute towards peace in Israel and Palestine. I actually am a little bit out of my element. I mean, it was rather unique, my being on the Tucker show. And so I just want to say I'm thankful to be here with a scholar such as Mustafa Askul, who has fearlessly and perhaps provocatively at times promoted a vision of Islam that leaves room to embrace all faiths, and a courageous speaker like Peter Beinart, who has trod the fine line of being a defender of his Jewish faith and people, while also not being afraid to examine critically its deficiencies at this explosive time in its history. So I'm not a scholar. I'm just an Orthodox Christian nun, and I'm someone who generally would be taking part in not in worldly secular activities. As a nun, my day would be in prayer, 5 to 6 hours a day, having some simple obediences, and the remainder of the time in solitary reading and reflection in your monastic cell. But I'm taking some solace and encouragement from the words of Evagrius the Solitary, a monk who lived in the 4th century in Egypt, who said, "If you're a theologian, you will pray truly, and if you pray truly, you are a theologian." So perhaps through prayer, I can find some words that can help us discuss this way of bringing a path to peace in the Middle East. I went to the Holy Land in 1996, and I transferred from my small community upstate New York to the convent of St. Mary Magdalene, right on the Mount of Olives, near the Garden of Gethsemane, where Jesus Christ betrayed before his betrayal by Judas and subsequent arrest by the Roman authorities. From my cell, I could look out the walls of the old city of Jerusalem, constructed by Sultan Suleiman the Magnificent in the 1500s. Directly below me were the whitewashed tombs of faithful Jews, who consider this spot to be the most significant place to be buried, as it stands before the remaining remnants of the last Jewish temple, the Wailing Wall. And next to the wall, you have the Al-Aqsa Mosque, third holiest site in the Islamic faith, and the gleaming Dome of the Rock, constructed above the site where all the Abrahamic faiths say that their shared father Abraham, at God's command, was willing to sacrifice his son. Definitely one of the most intense places of the world. Yet behind the gates of the convent, nestled in a monastic cell, I never knew such peace. My life revolved around prayer and obediences. And I rarely went outside the gates. I didn't know what was New City, Old City, Israel, Palestine. Yet, during my 10 years in Jerusalem, I came to know the states and the roads of the state of Israel and all the parts of the occupied territories like the back of my hand. So I come from that experience today to speak a little bit about what I came to know. It's interesting what Peter had to say about, it seems to be we have a connection now that the Jewish tradition, the Jewish faith, has become too closely united to the idea of the state of Israel. So that left a blank, and you actually answered the question for me, because I was pondering on. So I'll go back. I was at the convent in Jerusalem, and then I was asked after 2 years to run our girls' school of Bethany, which was in the town of Al-Azadiya, next to Jerusalem. And we had so in our school we had 350 girls. Most of them were Muslim, 98%, because we were in East Jerusalem. And we also had some boarding students that came from Christian background, who came from Israel, from the state of Israel. So I wrote at the school, but and what I came from there is and I just met Catherine Habib today and was talking about throughout the Levant. I had the chance to travel in Syria and Lebanon, and I saw something that I wasn't aware of as someone who grew up in America, how Muslims and Christians could live and work together. And I think that's the most important thing that was surprising to me, but also gives me hope for the future. Because I went to the school in 1998, and at that time, there were at least Jewish Israelis who were contemplating a peaceful resolution to the conflict with their neighbors. And you had that kind of an outreach. And then within what I saw in Bethany was that people could live together in coexistence. As a Greek living in US, I had rare contact with Muslims. So in fact, sorry for Mustafa, my only connection to Islam would have been thinking about Greeks being under the Turkish occupation from the 15th century to the 19th century, or the reality that we could not no longer use the great church of Hagia Sophia for our services. But what I found in living in the Middle East was that we could live together. You know, in our school we had crosses and icons, and that wasn't a problem for anyone there. And all the institutions, many Christian institutions were there, schools, hospitals, nursing homes, that could be found throughout all the Middle East and served Muslims as well as Christians. In fact, I was even kind of surprised. I remember going into the Church of Nativity and the Holy Sepulchre and seeing Muslims there and saying, well, what are they doing here? But then I came to understand, you see Jesus as a prophet and you recognize and respect him. And then just through my own personal experience, the connection between Muslims and Christians in our community. People would tell me about going to the Church of St. George in Lydda, Muslims, to honor the feast the same as the Christians. Or a really wonderful story that sort of ties in with the occupation. We lived in Al Azadiya and we were under curfew. And always before the feast of St. Lazarus, where the tomb was in Bethany, all the nuns would gather and walk to the tomb of Lazarus. But because there was curfew, the nuns weren't allowed to come from Jerusalem. So there were only a handful of us at the school who would be going there that day. And I remember the two priests that were there, the two nuns that were with me, we decided it was 10 o'clock at night. We had finished our service on a Friday night. Yes, we're going to go and visit the tomb of St. Lazarus. And I walked towards the tomb, past Israeli soldiers who did let us get there. It was about a half a mile away. And who's waiting there for us but Aziz, the Muslim caretaker of the tomb of St. Lazarus. So I think what I'm trying to say is that I just felt that there's a natural connection in Islam and Christianity, a respect for the sites, and I just found that striking at first, and I think it gives us hope again for the future. So what's the foundation that allows for such a coexistence? Sorry, I lost my train of thought here. Like I said, I'm not really used to doing this to go on, but so I didn't abandon the Holy Land. After I was forced to leave there in 2006, but I began to make pilgrimages twice a year. And what did I see? From Jerusalem, I would travel down to Jericho, pass by the Inn of the Good Samaritan. And what lesson do we learn there? It was not the priest or the pious religious leader who helped the Jewish man lying beaten on the side of the road, but it was an outsider, the Samaritan who helped his neighbor. And I think this is what's so critical and what Peter was talking about. A lesson to teach us not to let our religious identity be a barrier to aiding our neighbor in a time of want. And as a proud pilgrim, we travel north from Jericho and up the Sea of Galilee, where Christ performed his miracles of healing and preached his message of salvation, a message that can only truly be understood by those who follow the precepts found in the Beatitudes. You know, you go over north over the shore of the Sea of Galilee, and there's a large Catholic church marking the location where Christ preached a sermon on the Mount containing the words such as these: Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. Blessed are the merciful, for they shall be shown mercy. Blessed are you when people insult you, persecute you, and say all manner of evil against you because of me. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad, because great is your reward in heaven. And finally, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. And when I reflect on these words, two thoughts come to mind. First is the great admiration and respect I have for many, many more than those who resort to violence and despair, who have endured suffering in Gaza and the West Bank over the last 2 years, be they Muslim or Christian. How many times have I reached out to friends there who have lost loved ones or suffered lesser losses by having property confiscated or jobs that are no longer able to go to, so they're in need. They've been harassed by settlers or tormented by the sounds of bombs overhead. Yet rarely is the response from them one of bitterness, anger, or revenge. Instead, from both Muslim and Christian, I hear how they bear humbly and endure, saying only, our life is in the hands of God. And this is the message that is imbued in that land there. They recognize themselves as being people of God. And what strikes even deeper in my heart is they don't dwell on their circumstances, but with a merciful heart, they ask, how are you? Or how is your sister doing? Or how is your concern? And I think this is born from a tradition that had its beginnings in Judaism. But because Judaism didn't build on what was there, Christianity took that foundation that Peter speaks of too, that's really basic to all of us in our heart. And it's encompassed as well in the beatitude, blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called sons of God. So at least, I'm speaking sort of in religious terms here as a pious little nun, but what I also come in as is as a witness. So I lived there and I saw how at least Muslims and Christians could live in peace. And that's something that we don't hear too often in the West. And I think Peter's explained why, quite frankly, our interaction, we really had very little to do with the Jewish community. It didn't mean that there weren't people of goodwill there, but you didn't see it. And I think the thing that we have to talk about is the great devolution that has happened over the last 25 years. I moved there in 1996, and like I said, 96 to 2000, you could say there was still a peace camp. There were still Israeli Jews that were looking towards living in peace with their brothers and sisters. But as I go back every year, and what you see now has been, I think, because of the policies of Netanyahu and those like him, Smotrich and Ben-Gvir. Think back. When I moved there in 1996, it was 6 months removed from Yitzhak Rabin having been assassinated by Jewish zealots, people who have taken their faith in the wrong direction. And at that time, in 96, 97, 98, those people were on the fringes of Israeli society. But what's happened over the last 25 years is that they've become the voice of the society, to the great detriment of what I hope is a silent majority that is still within Israel that does want to get back to basic principles that are rooted in all three Abrahamic faiths of care for your neighbor, of reaching out and being a peacemaker. So I just want to end with, how are we going to come to some resolution of this? And one big factor is the religious leaders. And finally, because it has become such a desperate situation, it's so 25 years ago, I could see that I called it genocide by Chinese water torture. So it was clear that something was not going right, the way things were moving in Israel and Palestine. But what was also true was that that the church has to speak up more. And that I guess in my wildest imagination, I thought, after I left Jerusalem, because I had spoken out in Washington, I would then come back every year with pilgrim groups. But I used to think, how long are we going to be able to do this? And I guess it was sort of this imaginary idea that, yeah, sometime in the future, Holy Sepulchre and Church of Nativity will be like Hagia Sophia for a Christian. It'll only be a museum or even something less. But it was something that didn't really feel like, can this really happen? But today, I'm here to tell you that it can happen. And finally, the Latin patriarch and the Jerusalem patriarch, Greek Orthodox, are speaking out about that. It's almost like the last second, the last gasp. The Theophilus, the Greek Orthodox patriarch, has spoken out and says, the church cannot turn its face away from human pain. Our Lord teaches us that whatever we do for the least among us, we do for him. So he's calling out that he's alarmed by what's happening to the Christian communities, and that we have to not only relieve their suffering, but like I like to say too, is not keep putting a Band-Aid on the problem. I can go to America and I say, my friends in the Northern West Bank and the church is there, they don't have money, or that so we keep just sustaining the wound, the conflict, instead of looking for an end to it. And the same with the Latin patriarch, Pier Babista Pizzabella. He's been very courageous in speaking out, but he says he recognizes that hearts have to change. So that's the responsibility of religious leaders, is to give a vision of how we can work together in the future for peace. But the real crux of the matter is, yes, we pray, but then we have to have a political solution. And I think everyone in this room and listening to this knows that ultimately the political solution lies with the United States. If America, to ending the occupation, and then you can begin to talk, will we have one state or two states? Until we end the occupation, nothing can be done. So this primarily lies with the United States. If we stop funding the means that allow the occupation to continue, if we stop providing the diplomatic cover, then we can begin to come to a solution. Part of the problem with this continued policy of the United States is that we rely too much on the lobby groups, and people point to AIPAC, but the other critical problem are the Christian evangelicals. And this is where I, as a Christian, have to speak out and have to witness as a Christian that the Christian Zionist community does not speak for all the Christians, and particularly does not speak for the Christians of the Holy Land. So if we're going to have only any change, it has to come from the traditional churches here in the United States, the Orthodox and the Catholic, beginning to come together and say, not just as Jews have been doing, not in our name are we going to allow this occupation to continue. Christians have to rise up and say, Christian Zionism is not the way to the peace, because all it does, it enforces that Judaic idea that you were talking about of exclusivity, of only counting or not Judaic, but Israeli idea that replaced Judaism by focusing so much on the creation of the state or the creation of a law or abiding by a law instead of acting with a merciful heart and with compassion for our neighbors. So I know I haven't been very coherent, and I hope I can do better with the questions. But my basic point is that to make today is that I do believe that Christianity provides a foundation, having gotten its roots in the beginning from Judaism, and then Islam having carried over and accepted many of those same principles, that within our faiths, we can find a way that people can live together in any land where there's conflict. But we also have to do the practical things that will bring about peace. And most importantly, for the Christian community now, is to speak out and to work towards change instead of continuing, allowing the policies to continue.
Thank you very much, Mother Agapia. And in fact, you have been very coherent. I mean, it's really an impressive speech. Thank you very much. Mustafa? Yes, please.
Assalamu alaikum and good afternoon, and thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be at MPAC and to meet its wonderful, brilliant team again. And it's an honor to be on the same panel with Mother Agapia and Peter Beinart, both of which are, I think, brave defenders of human dignity and human rights in this very dark moment of, I think, history. Now, I want to bring a little bit of a historical perspective to this discussion and share a few anecdotes or facts that I covered in my book published last year, The Islamic Moses, How the Prophet Inspired Jews and Muslims to Flourish Together. In 1748, Rabbi Abraham Gershon from Quito, Poland, a Hasidic rabbi, migrated to Hebron. And in a letter that he sent back home to his brother, he expressed his astonishment with the state of Jewish life he found in the Holy Land. He wrote, "In this holy city, there's a Jewish courtyard which Jews are permitted to close during the Sabbath and festival. No one can come in or out all night, and they virtually have no fear of Gentiles. And it's not only this, but the local Gentiles, even the greatest ones, love the Jews very much. When there's a celebration, such as circumcision, their leaders come to celebrate with Jews and dance with the Jews." Now, I learned about this letter from an article by Prof. Yitzhak Melamed of Johns Hopkins University, published in Torah.com, and the title is Hasidic-Muslim Relations in Ottoman Palestine. Here, Dr. Melamed, after translating the letter from Hebrew, he says, "The tone of the letter makes it clear that Rabbi Gershon could hardly believe the reality that transpired before his eyes. having spent most of his life in Eastern Europe, he was not accustomed to see Gentiles who dance with the Jews in their celebration and treat them as beloved neighbors. Now, of course, no single letter or document fully explains a historical era, but I think there is some historical truth indeed captured by this document and many other documents from the era, where rabbis who came to the Ottoman Empire and telling, like the Rabbi Yitzhak Sarfati in the 1400s, saying his co-religionists in Germany, why are you still staying in that accursed land? Come to this land here, the Ottoman Empire, where we have freedom and to worship our religion, to worship according to our religion. There's some truth, and that truth is until the dark century, which is the 20th century, this land was a place where Jews, Christians, and Muslims could coexist and could see each other as good neighbors rather than sworn enemies. Now, how did that lost pluralism happen? We got almost insight into it. I mean, Peter explained how Judaism emerged as a monotheistic Abrahamic faith with a sense of human dignity in human history. It was a huge change in that sense, theological scene, but it was just confined to the Jewish people. Then two outbursts of that Abrahamic monotheism happened in world history. One was Christianity, the earlier one, thanks to a rabbi from Nazareth, Jesus of Nazareth, and his disciples. And the second one was Islam. And with all due respect, Islam even stayed more loyal to some of the core foundations of Judaism because it carried out the same theology. They didn't get into the more Trinitarian theology. And it also kept the importance of law, different from the direction Christianity take with the perspective of Paul. That's why the halakha and the sharia are very similar and important concepts in Islam. And I think they should be discussed in tandem today, not just in exclusion. But anyway, so Islam emerged as this third big manifestation of Abrahamic monotheism. And one thing that's interesting about Islam is that it started as a anti-idolatrous, as a monotheist campaign in 7th century Arabia, but always considered Jews and Christians as fellow monotheists. The Quran brought certain criticisms toward Jews and Christians, and some people too much focus on that. But also the Quran said they are fellow monotheists. They're the people of the book. They follow the Torah and the gospel, which is highly respected, venerated in the Quran. The Quran presents itself as the third testament, if you will, after these two, the first and the Old and the New Testaments, using a Christian terminology there. And that is also why Islamic law from the very beginning accepted the rights of Jews and Christians to practice their religion under Muslim rule. That's why when Islam quickly became an empire right after the time of Prophet Muhammad, peace be upon him, stretching from Spain to India, Muslims conquered places. And I think, I'm not glorifying conquest today. It was an age of empires that happened. I don't think we have to bring that mentality today. But in this huge empire they created, they allowed Jews and Christians to keep their places of worship and their religious traditions. It wasn't equal citizenship that we enjoy in the modern world today, so it cannot be idealized. But for its time, actually, it was a quite tolerant model. That's why when Jews were persecuted in Christendom, as it was called at the time, Europe, forced to convert to Christianity, they repeatedly migrated to the lens of Islam. It happened in Ashkenazi communities first, and then the major Sephardic migration to the Ottoman Empire. It was a blessing for them to come to Ottoman lands. And Islam's pluralism also, Islam's pluralism was also evident in Jerusalem, the holy city we're discussing today. Just a few years after the Prophet, Muslims conquered Jerusalem under the time of Caliph Umar. Bloodless conquest. I mean, there was a siege, but after that, Jerusalem surrendered. And Christians were worried that these Arabs would come and slaughter them all, and it was this new religion. But instead, Caliph Umar came and, respectfully met the patriarch. The patriarch was surprised that he was, not dressed so well compared to himself. But he said, we'll keep your religion. Don't worry. I mean, he visited the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. and said, "You're going to keep your church. We're not going to touch it." Actually, the patriarch invited him to pray in the church according to one tradition written in Islamic sources. And he said, "If I do here, Muslims then can maybe convert it into a mosque." So he prayed outside, and that place became the small Caliph of Umar, which is still there in the old city in Jerusalem. And then he wanted to see the Temple Mount. And Christians said, like, it's a dumpster. What do you want to do there? Jews were kicked out centuries ago, and Christians were using it as a place to throw trash. And Caliph Umar, with a convert to Judaism, Ka'b al-Ahbar, and went there to see that. He was surprised that this Temple of Solomon was in such bad shape. With his own hands, he started to clean the place, and Muslims leveled and cleaned the Temple Mount. And a few decades later, Muslims built the Dome of the Rock, the Qubbat al-Sahra, and it became the Masjid al-Aqsa. Now, what is interesting is that Jews at the time welcomed this Islamic conquest of Jerusalem for a few reasons. First of all, before this Islamic conquest, Jews were not welcome in Jerusalem. Actually, they were expelled first by the Romans, the pagan Romans, that Christianity kept that. And because they sided with the Sassanids, Christians were looking at Jews suspiciously. Caliph Umar negotiated with the Christians to be able to bring Jews back in to Jerusalem. And 77 families were settled at his time, which we know from documents in the Cairo Geniza. And when Muslims built the Dome of the Rock, Jews were also happy again because it was a beautiful place now. It was a place of worship, a place to worship Abraham. That's why in this very interesting document, The Secrets of Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, a 17th century document, that rabbi himself was from much earlier, but in this Jewish document, Islam is praised as a sign of a messianic age, liberating Jews from slavery and bringing them into Jerusalem. And Jerusalem became a multi-faith city, which continued all the way until the dark century, 20th century. There was another dark century in between, the Crusaders, when they came and occupied, invaded Jerusalem. They killed Jews, they killed Muslims, they killed a lot of Eastern Christians too. They probably didn't distinguish, and they saw them as heretics anyway. But luckily, finally, when the Christians were pushed out by Islamic commander Salah ad-Din, Jerusalem became pluralist again. Jews could come back to the city again. One thing, this Islamic tolerance was, as I said, was not egalitarian. So the dhimmi state is much criticized in the modern world today. Oh, they were, yes, from a modern point of view, Muslims were superior, Christians and Jews were paying extra taxes. There were some legal limitations. However, it's important that the Ottoman Empire, the seat of the Islamic Caliphate in the 19th century, actually abolished this status and accepted equal citizenship. That happened in the Tanzimat or Reform period, and it culminated in the Ottoman Constitution of 1876, which declared all Ottomans are equal regardless of religion or race. So Jews and Christians became equal citizens of the empire. And in the Ottoman parliament that can meet next year under the Caliphate, 1/3 of the Ottoman parliament in Istanbul was Jewish and Christian. This was the scene, and that's why Alan Doty, in his book Arabs and Jews in Ottoman Palestine, says, in the 19th century, none of the observers foresaw the conflict that was yet to come. People couldn't think of something like this back then, that that's horrific, that there will be wars and murders and expulsions and horrific violence of all kinds. But the conflict did come, and why it came is, I think, important to note. I think it didn't come because of mere religion, because these religions were there already. It came because of a new force that actually swept through the whole Ottoman territories and created incredible bloodshed. The name of that force is nationalism. It is the idea that a group of people owns a land and it is their country, it's their nation state, right? It came first in the Balkans. The famous slogan in the Balkans in the 19th century is Serbia is for the Serbs, Greece is for the Greeks. With all respect to Greeks, I mean, they deserve, of course, homeland, but Bulgaria is for the Bulgarians. Now, this sounds very nice until you realize you're in the borders of Serbia and you're not Serbian, right? Then you are a problem. You don't fit into the majority. What do? They expel you. If you're going by yourself, they kill you thinking that you will go. So that's why horrific violence, ethnic violence swept through the Balkans. Seeing this, Turks became also super nationalist, excessively nationalist. Their nationalism, fierce nationalism, had a toll on Armenians, which were horrifically expelled with violence, massacres, and mass killings in 1915. A tragedy that I think my people, the Turks, have not yet fully, honestly faced. And then Turkey and Greece said, we have too many Greeks here. You have too many Turks there. What are we going to do? Let's expel them. So 1 million people were uprooted one night and sent there. And they were like, this idea to make these nations fit their peoples just created more and more violence and mass displacement and so on and so forth. And then it came to the Middle East, right? And I think what we're seeing in Israel-Palestine is yet another tragic, horrific face of nationalist conflict. Two people saying, this is my land, right? And each one of them says, you have nothing to do with this. Your claim to it is totally false or it's bogus and it will be all ours, right? I mean, so the maximalism on both sides wants to claim it. Now, I see this as another conflict between the peoples of the empire, right? I mean, some, of course, Zionists came from Europe and Russia, so there's a foreign element, like a migration element here. That's why people connected to colonialism as well. But let's not forget half of maybe Israel's society as Mizrahi Jews, peoples of that region as well. Now, if a nationalist conflict happens, there is no way to get rid of one side's passion to have his homeland. I mean, that's what we observed. The best thing you can do is to reconcile them with some political formulas. This happened in the Balkans in 1990s, where Bosnians, my wife's people, were the target of a genocide committed by Serbian ultranationalists. Alija Izetbegović, with his great wisdom, accepted the Dayton Agreement, which was not ideal what the Bosnians deserved, but it still ended the war. If you today go to Bosnia, in Sarajevo, there's Republika Srpska there, those guys did this to you, so they're not maybe your best friends, but everybody's happy that the killing has stopped and everybody got something, right? So that's a kind of a confederational formula. Another example is Cyprus. There was ethnic conflict in Cyprus again between Turks and Greece, and there is a two-state solution in Cyprus since 1974. Not ideal, but at least it stopped the killing, and you can still go to Cyprus and enjoy five-star hotels on the Turkish side or the other ones on the Greek side. And which means the conflict in the Holy Land today, called the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, will only end when those two people who say this land is ours, with understandable arguments and passions, and one is deep-rooted in history and theology, the other is lived reality of the Palestinians themselves, they may find a way to live together. And we will help this. I'm not Israeli, I'm not Palestinian, so I'm not going to say this should be the solution. Who am I? But I think as third parties, including politicians in the city, right, a few blocks down there, they will be helping this problem only if they honor both peoples. If they say only one people legitimate and we will help them get rid of the other one, that will be one of the most evil things that happen in this part of the world, just mass destruction and displacement of a people. So the claim and the passions and the deep-rooted sense of identity of both sides have to be acknowledged, and we should then start to think, how can 7 million Arabs and 7 million Jews, 7 million Palestinians, some of who are Christian, most of them are Muslims, can live at peace? Because as Peter said, they're all human beings that deserve equal freedom and equal rights. That's my book ends with a slogan. You might have heard the slogan, from the river to the sea. It goes on like that. My slogan, my version of that slogan is that from the river to the sea, both people should be free and every child should be safe. How do we get there? I still don't have a magic formula, but I think that is the only goal that is legitimate in this terrible scene. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Mustafa. It's another excellent presentation. We have about half an hour for Q&A. I have a few questions in my mind, but let's start with the audience. I want to give you as much time as possible. Mike, please.
Yes, Haytham Al-Khatib, a professor of mathematics at the University of Baltimore. I have two questions for everyone, but the second question is especially for Mustafa. The first question, is coexistence primarily a political project or a moral theological one? In other words, can laws create coexistence without the transformation of hearts? And the second question, especially for you, Mustafa, is peace possible without justice? Or must one side accept injustice temporarily for a peace to emerge? Thank you.
Thank you so much. Very thoughtful questions. On the first one, I can say you need, of course, both political and social reconciliation. But which one starts first can change from situation to situation. In Bosnia, in 1995, when the Dayton Agreement ended the horrific civil war, which included a genocidal campaign against the Bosnians, there didn't come a softening of hearts right away and led to a what happened is that Bosnians were able to defend themselves, and the Serbs couldn't realize they can go forward, and ultimately the U.S. intervened, not being on one side and trying to really finding a solution. If the U.S. sided with the Serbian onslaught against the Bosnians, maybe it would just go on and on. Luckily, the U.S. didn't do that, and I appreciated U.S. foreign policy at the time. And it was a kind of nobody can get forward. Which brings me to the second part of the question. Ali Izetbegovic at the time, who I really deeply admire as both a political leader and an Islamic intellectual. I mean, his writings are phenomenal too. He said, you used the referred justice and peace. He said, I prefer peace to ultimate justice. And in his mind, the Bosnians deserved more than what they got, but continuing the fight would lead to endless conflict. And he still chose to accept a solution that was not ideal, but still gave Bosnians a safe home and they could live with. Some people actually criticize Izetbegovic for that today, but I think he did the right thing. I mean, if you ask me. And so therefore, I think if you go with the perspective of justice, I think I understand how the Palestinians feel about all this. I mean, this was they were living in this country, it was there, and some people came from outside and they just started to take bits and pieces more and more and more. But ultimately, what can be achieved, because the other side also has a claim and has a narrative and has a passion, and which is not going to go away. So therefore, I think
It has a much stronger military.
yes, and they have and ultimately, history is made through some battles and wins. I mean, probably the Ottomans know this more than anyone else. I mean, well, for the Ottomans, Bosnia was ours, right? I mean, for 4 centuries. For the Greeks, actually, it's Turkish occupation, as Madara Kapia says that. I mean, so I understand how now Turks are happy that we have Hagia Sophia as a mosque again. And, well, ask the Greeks, they don't feel like that. That's why I actually suggested sharing Hagia Sophia, but nobody was interested in this kumbaya ideas in Turkey at the time. So therefore, pragmatism is sometimes needed to achieve a solution we can live with. And I think one thing that I see is on one side, there is some narratives on the Israeli right wing. I mean, Palestinians don't exist. It's a lie. They just came from outside. It never existed. I mean, as if the word is a myth. I mean, Jerusalem was originally called Palestine Post, the newspaper, because it was called Palestine. I mean, it was where Jews migrated to Palestine. I mean, this rabbi I mentioned, he was migrating to Palestine, which was a land. Oh, it was not an independent country. Well, who was an independent? Greece was not an independent country. Serbia was not an independent country. Turkey was not an independent country. It was all the Ottoman Empire. So there is a willful campaign to deny the identity and the belonging of the Palestinians. On the other hand, I think, if you ask me my honest opinion, if we see the Israeli nation-state idea as a merely colonial project, we make the analogy of Algeria and France. You get rid of colonialism by kicking the colonials out. But I think that leads the conflict to a unresolvable dilemma, because that's not how Israelis see it. And no matter what we say, they say, this was our land too, 3,000 years ago. I mean, you can say, I don't care, but they care. And that's not going to change. That's why I believe in a live and live let solution, which which requires maybe compromises from absolute justice that we want to achieve. And my guide there again is Ali Ezebega, which I think his legacy is I think interesting thing to study in this. And I'm saying this as not a Palestinian. Who am I? But I'm saying this as an Ottoman. Who cares for the peoples of this region, and seeing all these things happening through this region and trying to find some way for peace.
Peace or justice?
I mean, I think the irony is that there is no perfect justice in this world. But the closer you get to justice, the more likely the more likely you are to have true peace, right? Because I was referring earlier to the book of Exodus. A lot of rabbinic commentary tries to understand this question of why, when the Israelites leave Egypt, they are given this gold and silver. That they depending on how they take this gold and silver from the Egyptians. They don't usually use it very well because they use it to build the golden calf. So one interpretation is actually that they had to be given this in order to make them not hate the Egyptians, right? That essentially that it was a kind of reparations. And if you want to overcome hatred, there has to be a form of justice. Otherwise, there's not a true peace between people. So I think that because perfect justice is never attainable, what is crucial is that you have legitimate political leaders who are chosen by their people, who can make the difficult decisions for their people about accepting certain compromises given the realities. And one of the problems that I think tragedies in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is that both Israel and the United States have refused to allow Palestinians to choose their own leaders through a legitimate process. And the irony of that is actually, it is because you don't have Palestinian leaders now who have the strength and legitimacy to make any compromise with Israel. Because you need credibility with your own people, and you need a legitimate process of choosing leadership for leaders to be able to then say, this is the path we should take, even if it's not perfect, right? Nelson Mandela had the legitimacy among Black South Africans to accept things in South Africa that he knew would lead to the right to vote, but probably not really change the economy of South Africa fundamentally enough to create as much true justice as Black South Africans deserve. And I think it's only when Palestinians have the right to choose their own leaders through elections, through a reconstituted PLO that can represent all the different Palestinian political parties, that you can have Palestinian leaders who can make their own choices about what compromises they're willing to accept. It can't be imposed upon them by Israel and the United States.
Same thing on the Israeli side. You have a prime minister who's not willing to compromise. He's elected, and represents the majority, but he's not willing to compromise and recognize a Palestinian state or rights for the Palestinian people.
Right. I mean, I would just say briefly, and then I'll turn it over. It's because the United States and Europe have allowed Netanyahu to not have to make compromises, and Israel has not had to face any consequences from its major economic partners in Europe and its major military partners in the United States. Netanyahu's political career has, for years and years and years, people on the center in Israel, like Ehud Barak and Tzipni Livni, were saying, we're not going to be able to get away with it. If we continue the settlement project, we're ultimately going to become a pariah. And Netanyahu said, you don't understand America. It'll be fine. And the United States proved Netanyahu right. And that is why the United States has been really crucial to Netanyahu's political success.
The only thing I'd add to that, I agree with Peter that until we have a legitimate leader, especially on the Palestinian side, you're not going to have any movement towards creating a just peace over there. But the way, the Christians are sort of the silent minority. I noticed you spoke of a conflict between two, sort of putting in the context of Palestinian Muslim probably and Israeli. So the point I was trying to make before is that I think Christianity and its principles have something that we can learn from. And sadly, we're seeing it both in the United States in how our administration acts now and how we act in supporting Israel, is that we've abandoned any sort of moral and ethical principles in our governing. And if we got back to that, then our governments would be working in a way that would help lead to a just peace. instead of relying. To me, Netanyahu and Trump are two sides of the same coin. Both people, they're not really based on theology or ideology. It's mostly myself, which is as far from any sort of ethical and Christian principles as you can get. So if we can move away from that kind of thinking,
And,
then
and
government
the
can move in a
Christians
better
are a
direction.
minority
Mhm.
in the Middle East, but they're a majority here.
But unfortunately, it's the form of Christianity that has justified continuing in occupation, like I say, and working on principles. Actually, American Christianity is based on money, success, which is very far from what traditional Christianity actually offers.
Other questions? Yes, please.
My name is Catherine Habib. I'm an Orthodox Christian. Peter, I just was meditating on your mentioning and description of how Jewish thought and Jewish engagement changed from an earlier period in American history on its civil rights movement, justice, and now has shifted, it seems, to defending an ethnocentric state, very conservative, hardline politics. What within the Jewish community or from outside of it, what do you think contributed most significantly to that shift?
I think it's important, first of all. Is it, no? Is it working now? Yeah. I think it's important to distinguish what I would call the American Jewish organizational establishment from American Jews as a whole, right? American Jews as a whole, if you look at voting patterns, actually, are quite distinctive, right, in their willingness to stick with the Democratic Party, even as many other kind of white ethnic groups have actually gravitated towards the Republican Party. So there is, I think, still a fairly strong sense among ordinary American Jewish voters that that ethno-nationalism in the United States is actually very, very dangerous, right? The problem is that the most powerful American Jewish organizations, not all of them, but the most powerful ones, you know, AIPAC, the Anti-Defamation League, and others, redefined themselves. I mean, AIPAC became much more prominent. AIPAC was not a particularly prominent organization in the middle of the 20th century. In fact, the guy who ran AIPAC in the 1970s would like to joke that people were often confusing it with OPEC. Basically, he would say, "I represent AIPAC," and they would say, "OPEC, what?" So it was a fairly marginal organization. There are a number of things that happened basically starting in the late 60s and early 1970s, but briefly, the civil rights movement succeeded. And also American Jews did essentially move into first-class citizenship. So the project of American Jewish organizational life in 40s, 50s, 60s was largely completed, right? And also assimilation meant that American Jews, essentially many of the most progressive-minded American Jews, no longer needed to operate through Jewish organizations. If you wanted to fight for civil rights in the 1940s, if you're Jewish, you might feel more comfortable doing it in a Jewish organization because there were still greater social barriers. A generation or two later, Jews are just outside of these Jewish organizations. So who are the people who remain in these Jewish organizations? They are more tribal. And there's also a surge in American Jewish identification with Israel after the 1967 war, which is perceived as this near-death experience for Israel. Whether it was or not is a separate question. And that happens at the same movement that you see the global and the American left moving away from Israel, as represented by the 1975 UN Zionism equals racism resolution. So it's in that moment, after 67, that you have this emergence of this idea that the new anti-Semitism is now coming from the left against Israel. And that the way to fight against anti-Semitism is to defend Israel. It's also really important to recognize that as these American Jewish organizations have many of them have lost their large donor base because American Jews have assimilated, they have become more and more beholden to small numbers of large donors, right? And so the American Jewish organization has become a kind of oligarchy in the way that all of America has become an oligarchy, because that's where the money is, right? And so if you want to look at why American Jewish organizations are no longer committed as they once were to questions of economic justice, it's because they're funded by millionaires and billionaires. Of course, don't care about economic justice, right? So unfortunately, these have been the trends that I think have led us to the point now where you can have the Anti-Defamation League basically setting up like a kind of watch monitor program on Zoran Mamdani, right? And not on Donald Trump, right? Even though Zoran Mamdani supports the idea that Zoran Mamdani is far less dangerous to Jews in the United States than Donald Trump is, because Mamdani is a believer in the principle of equality under the law for everybody, which is the principle that has actually under which Jews have flourished. And Donald Trump, in his own insane way, is part of a group of people who want to create a kind of white Christian nation in which everyone who's not a white, male, straight, native-born Christian is going to be basically told, you better be on your best behavior because you're not really fully American. And now, and then I'll stop. Now the mainstream Jewish organizations are realizing to their horror that this white Christian nationalism has huge amounts of anti-Semitism in it, right? Some of the anti-Semitism is pro-Israel, some of it is anti-Israel, right? But they foolishly thought that a movement that indulged anti-Muslim bigotry, anti-Black bigotry, anti-LGBT bigotry wouldn't get around to Jews. That is the most foolish thing you could possibly imagine. If you listen to Nick Fuentes, he says it very explicitly. He said, this is what I say to the Republicans. I say, you let me say anything I want about Muslims, and anything I want about Black people, and anything I want about LGBT people. So why can't I about Jews, right? And once you've accepted that Faustian bargain, you have no leg to stand on in terms of fighting against anti-Semitism.
Yes, Horam. For the benefit of people who are on Zoom.
My question is, how do you foresee the conflict in the Holy Land influencing the 2026 midterm elections?
Say it again. Say it again. How do you see the election in 2026?
I was going to say, like the conflict that's happening in Israel-Palestine. How do you foresee that influencing the elections and the midterm elections
The
here?
midterm elections.
Yeah, I'll start from Peter's the expert, but I'll start. Yeah, a little bit of political bloodline. I'm kind of hopeful that, I mean, obviously we're seeing a change, right? When you can have a Marjorie Taylor Greene who speaks out on the conservative side and the left, and the election of Mamdani and other things that are taking place that obviously. In fact, I remember when in the Democratic primary or the Democratic convention, when Harris didn't speak or didn't allow the Palestinian speaker, I understood right away she is not going to win this election.
Yeah.
So obviously, and people didn't want to recognize that at the time. So I think obviously the Israel-Palestine conflict weighs on the hearts of a lot of people, weighs in their decision making. So I think it's going to be a big factor, and I hope for a movement to good for everyone. Yes.
Mustafa?
I mean, I'm in the US in the past 7-8 years. I'm still discovering this fascinating country. I wasn't expecting this when I came. I was getting a little bit, wild ride. But I'm sometimes amazed at some passionate views some people in America have about a part of the world that they have never seen and been so confidently. I mean, I've seen people of Alabama deciding that the West Bank should be called Judea and Samaria. Like, what do you know about it, and with what authority? You have a beautiful country in Alabama, enjoy it. Like, how can you decide what the West Bank, Palestine internationally, is going to be called? And so there are these kind of there are ideological bubbles in this country. I mean, I've seen that, and I think one thing that a lot of Americans know, rightly so, is the Jewish people suffered immensely in history, including the Holocaust. They deserve to be safe everywhere, and they were able to establish a homeland. And okay, good, that's all nice. What does this mean for the people who were already there? Oh, well, we don't know. Like, if they're not real, they're not Palestinians. Why don't they go somewhere else? Like, they never heard maybe the story of someone who was living in Palestine for generations and who was kicked from his house in Haifa or Jerusalem or you name it in different parts of Palestine. Well, what you help establish also had a cost here, right? So, I mean, I was reading a column on the New York Times the other day, and it was saying, the columnist, I mean, we Christians know how much Jews suffered partly because of us. That's why we should stand with them. That's good, but is the price for that now other people should suffer for what you did to them back in your, that people who are not responsible for this? So I think the other side's story is willfully or sometimes unknowingly neglected, right? That's why I think people who defend the Palestinian cause rightly should put that forward. But they should put it forward in a way that also people can relate to. That's also important. How do you put it forward? Do you put it in a militant tone? Do you put it in a tone that seeks coexistence? Or do you put it in a tone that seeks revenge and destruction and so on? So that is also an important, and that's why I value MPAC's approach to these things a lot and my colleagues a lot. So, and the more you do that, actually you create other people get into trenches, right? So, I mean, one thing I've seen in the past 2 years is that, I mean, I think October 7 was wrong. Innocent people were killed, and that's not justified from an Islamic point of view, from a human point of view. And well, if you justify that, and then how do you on what basis do you then condemn Israeli actions in Gaza, right? I mean, so well, you should have the same principle of innocent human life. So the people who did, I think, justified October 7 didn't help the Palestinians, didn't help the Palestinian cause, didn't help the innocent people in Gaza who need a humanitarian international system survive, so on which they can have a ground.
How do you think the Palestinian problem is going to affect U.S. politics in the future? Not only the midterms, but the election after that and after that. Is there a real change in voters' perception?
I mean, there's a massive, massive change that's taking place, and it started among young progressives, but now it's moved across the Democratic Party. You see the generational divide among Democrats is shrunk because older Democrats are also becoming much more sympathetic. And now the frontier is among young conservatives who are becoming much, much more critical of Israel. So I think it creates a tremendous political opportunity for politicians who are willing to meet their bases, particularly in the Democratic Party, but even to some degree in the Republican Party, because there's a big gap in both parties between where the base of the party is now and where the leadership. It's a little bit like the gap that Donald Trump, noticed on the question of trade, for instance, between Republican elites and Republican voters, which he exploited. I am hopeful that there will be Democratic candidates in 2028 who support conditioning military aid and support processes of international justice, the International Criminal Court and International Court of Justice. And I think there will be Democratic candidates, and I think they'll find a very, very positive reception. I think Democrats who think they can have a soft AIPAC-like position in the Democratic Party are going to be in for a very rude awakening. I will say so that's a very positive story, but there is an element of it really does worry me. And it has to do with some of the anti-Zionism on the American right that I see with people like Candace Owens and Nick Fuentes and Tucker Carlson. And here I think is the problem, is that people on the left can see Israel and criticize Israel and Zionism with a structural analysis. They can think about imperialism and settler colonialism. But people on the right have a tendency, when they see things they don't like, to reduce that to identity, right? So if they see ISIS, they say, well, that's because of Muslims. That's how Muslims act. If they see a black person committing a crime, they say that's how black people act, because they don't have a structural analysis about imperialism, about poverty, about capitalism. And so what I hear from some on the right now, who are rightly deeply upset about what they see Israel has done in Gaza. They should be profoundly upset. They should want America to withdraw its support. But because they don't have a structural analysis, you hear people like Candace Owens saying, oh, well, this is what Jews do. Evidently, they don't have the same level of life that we Christians do. That, it seems to me, really worrying. And it's very tricky, because if you want to make policy change in the United States, you have to have bipartisan support, right? It's not only going to happen with Democrats, but I think People who believe in the principle of equality and who who oppose all forms of bigotry are going to have difficult decisions to make about how they engage with the kind of anti-Zionism which is emerging on the right, which does, far more than the anti-Zionism on the left, have some anti-Semitic elements in it.
Okay, we have 7 minutes left. Maybe we can take both questions at the same time and then conclude. Yes, please go ahead and then.
Given the sorry, given the title of the program, Muslim, Christian, Jewish approaches to peace, maybe an outsider could look at that and say, Ismail Kush, I'm a journalist. Some could ask or wonder how different is that, say, from the Abrahamic Accords? If so, how would you make that distinction?
Question.
Okay, I was interested in discussing more the divisions that we're seeing on the Christian right and the new anti-Zionist forces coming out of Tucker Carlson, et cetera. Is that making a dent in the Christian Zionist movement? Are there many Christian Zionists who are rethinking their support for Israel, et cetera? Or, where does this all stand?
Very good question. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, there's been some changes, both in the sense of, in a political sense, people like a Marjorie Taylor Greene leaving, but also you're beginning to see some Christian groups rising up now who are challenging their evangelical brothers and sisters. For example, in Chicago, there was a Churches at the Crossroads conference, 800 people, sponsored by Telos Group, and they're reaching out particularly, just like the Israeli lobby has been targeting evangelicals because they're weak in support, but Christians are reaching out to their Christian brothers and sisters and trying to get them to see that how can the precepts of your Christianity justify what's going on. And I just want to one other thing. I share some of Peter's concerns when it comes to the anti-Semitic overtones of the right. And I think that was actually a great caution that I had even taking part in that interview. You know, what was the angle going to be? I'm not here to justify Tucker, but I think what he has been talking about lately is getting away from that idea of tribalism and blood guilt and talking about if you really are truly a Christian, and if that inspires your political views as well, you look at the individual and you look at equal rights, and so there should be no room for anti-Semitism in that. And I hope that we can move in that direction. Yeah.
What do you think about the Abrahamic Accords?
I don't know if I can really answer to that. I don't know that that was inspired by the Abrahamic faith. I guess that's all I'll say.
Good.
That's it.
On this essentialization approach, I think some Jewish people are enjoying their nationalism, maybe first time in 2,000 years, and they seem too excited about it. But it's a dark road. I mean, Leibowitz was right to warn them. You know, I think right after the '67 expansion, saying that this is a dark road. That, you know, he warned Israelis about the curse of dominating another people. Right, that will be bad for your own soul as well. It's been terrible for the Serbians, my people, Turks. I mean, terrible things Turkish people have done to some groups in history out of nationalism, right? I mean, and I think we were better, you know, before that nationalist zeal, or when we can tame it. And of course, nationalism maybe never go away, but there are civic, humane versions of it versus fascist versions of it, right? I mean, so there's a drive towards that, and this can happen in any people. So that's the thing. It's not an essentialistic thing. I mean, look at who isn't. And Jews maybe never had this problem for 2,000 years because they never had a state. And that's why they were, as minorities, hoping for liberal reforms, especially in the past couple of centuries. But this is a different road that some people in Israel or some of their supporters may have entered. Now, on the Abraham Accords, I think there's nothing wrong with the vision of Israel peacefully integrating in the region and making trade and diplomatic relations with all countries. The problem there was it didn't offer anything to the Palestinian. The elephant in the room is the Palestinian question. I mean, Israel making peace with a third Arab country, Morocco, fine, no problem. But Israel is not war with Morocco either. It's not occupying Morocco either. What do you do with the Palestinians who are under occupation at least since 1967? Because I think since 1967, Palestinians in East Jerusalem, West Bank, and Gaza are neither citizen of Israel, but they are ruled by Israel. Israel doesn't give them the land, doesn't give them citizenship, takes away their homes, and yeah, make all peace with all the Arab countries. It's not going to change anything. Therefore, I think the flaw in Abrahamic Accords, which theologically or diplomatically is nice, but it's kind of assumed that this question will die out in itself. Then it didn't. And I think one thing Israeli people should understand, at least who support the status quo, is that there's no peace for them out of this as well. You can't sit on dominating another people for 7 million people out there and peacefully, and then you will have horrific explosions out of that. And October 7 was, if what it was a lesson in one thing, it was that. I mean, that sort of vision of peace doesn't work. It should start with resolving the Palestinian question. After that, Muslims won't have a problem with Israel. Most countries in the Muslim world today don't have a problem with Serbia. I still have a grudge, I should say, but once you can peacefully solve a problem, you can move forward. Yeah.
Peter?
I think the Abraham Accords came together because these various different countries have a common opposition to democracy. Netanyahu wants Israel to be embraced by the region without having to extend basic human rights, democratic rights to the Palestinians. And countries like the UAE and Bahrain see Israel as a helpful protector against Iran, but probably even more their own people, right? Israel is giving all these countries surveillance technology, helping them to basically repress their own populations. The deal...
Israel went to these Arab dictators
Right.
and said, I can help you in Washington.
Yes.
If you make peace with me, they will forget about human rights and democracy because we have a strong lobby in Washington.
Absolutely. Right. And Morocco turns a blind eye to the Palestinians, and America and everyone else turns a blind eye to Western Sahara. I think it's actually, and Dana, the Palestinian American political scientist Dana Al-Kurd, has done some really interesting polling data on this. She's arguing actually the Abraham Accords are going to be very bad for interreligious tolerance because it's associating the idea of religious tolerance with oppression, basically, both oppression both oppression in the Arab world and oppression in Israel. We've seen that Israel remains deeply, deeply unpopular in Arab and Muslim countries for very understandable reasons, given what it's due to the Palestinians. So it seems to me that it goes back to the centrality of the rights and dignity of the individual, that the road to interreligious tolerance goes through the rights of the individual, and to try to build a kind of an edifice of interreligious harmony and tolerance on the backbone of the crushing of the rights of the individual actually perverts the very idea of it.
Thank you very much. And we are exactly at 2:00, so perfect timing. I'd like to thank our speakers. Please join me in thanking our speakers for really excellent presentations, and they are being recorded, of course, and they'll be available online. So please share them as much as you can on your networks. Thank you on behalf of MPAC and CSID for joining us today. We look forward to seeing you. Happy Ramadan to those of you who will be celebrating tomorrow, inshallah. May Allah accept your fasting, and pray for peace. Pray for peace here in America, in the Middle East, and everywhere else. And inshallah, we'll see you at our next World Policy Forum. Thank you very much.